Hello, welcome back. Today I'm reading from a very special book. This is going to appear backwards. This book is called Sparrowmancer, and I wrote it. This is my 5th book, and I wrote it in 17 days. This was for NaNoWriMo, or National Novel Writing Month, and that's every November. Every November, authors around the world try to write 50,000 words, and this is about 51,000. It's not a very big book, but I am proud of it. I was going to read a little bit from this book today. Alright, let's get into it. Sparrowmancer, Chapter 1. Sparrow followed a dust storm east across the nameless wastes. Green lands went behind him, haunted. In no time, there were nothing. The high day skies were boundless spans of open blue. Mare's tail clouds appeared there in the cool of the evenings, and they remained through nights to mask the stars. In the mornings, they burned away. Sparrow stayed close behind the tempest. He kept his coat collar high and his wide goggles on, his copper hair wrapped in a turban. He'd outfitted his hoverbike for a desert traversal. Double-sealed gaskets, high front cowl, baronite intake filters. Its proton engine purred through weeks of hard riding. There was nothing to stop it. The storm led Sparrow to a mountain and then turned north. There was a shady bosque in the foothills. Sparrow stopped under the short trees and sat against the hoverbike for a long time. He took a big swig from a canteen. He would fill it soon. That was the next thing he would do. First, he took off his turban, his goggles, his scarf, his duster, his belted tabard, his bat-wing chaps. He stripped to his tattered undershirt and trousers and looked back the way he'd come. He saw the storm far off, and he wondered if it was looking at him, bidding him goodbye after so long, wishing him well. Beyond that were people he'd never see again, the wilderness he'd come through years ago. Everything back there was empty. Only what was ahead of him mattered. So he rolled up his discarded clothing and turned to look up the mountain. As the afternoon cooled, Sparrow walked a bit, pulling his bike along with him. The kinematic field rings that kept it hovering were tomb silent. It moved easily through the air 5 feet off the ground. He had acquired it in the green lands. Someone else had owned it, but now they were dead. There were so many dead that he had stopped trying to remember them all. They didn't follow him anymore, so he'd allowed himself to forget. Forgetting was the best luxury. Sparrow found a pool of clear water. He filled all his canteens and then waded naked into the pool. Water fell into it from the mountain, and it was cold. He could see right to the bottom, as if the water weren't even there. There were no plants or animals in it. He ducked under the surface and opened his eyes. After a few seconds he stood up and ran his hands through his wet hair. It was receding from his brow, and much of it was gray. His corkscrew beard was gray too. Sparrow swam and drank water. Then he lay on the grassy bank of the pool and slept in sunlight. When he awoke, he was dry and day was dimming. Mare's tail clouds appeared. There were fewer of them than in the desert. He could see more stars as they winked awake. He pulled on his clothes and thought about the people from the sky. Which of the waking stars was theirs? He would never know. They were gone behind him now. Sparrow made a fire. There were animals in the little wood. He fired his golden rifle at a blue-furred thing with a long tail, but it dodged away from him and hid up a tree. There he found something slower in a burrow, killed it, and took it back to the fire to dress it. It should be then he found, rather than there. I misread that word. It was nice and fatty. He lay upon his rubber blanket, looked up at the unveiled stars, and counted a few satellites. There were machines up there. What did they see when they looked down at what was left of the world? Could they see him? He thought about something he had read once. Absurdity is the purest form of honesty. So the gods are absurd, and we make them liars when we try to make sense of them. He said this aloud to himself, and tried to believe that it was sacred insight, but he couldn't make that belief real. When sleep came, it brought Sparrow a dream of bright, colorful distance, through which he hurtled at breakneck speed. Far ahead he saw people walking carefully. They weren't coming toward him. They didn't even know he was there. He was nobody to them. Morning brought rain. Clouds piled together against the mountain wall and spilled themselves for a while on the little wood. Sparrow walked south beneath the short trees as they opened thirsty blooms. To his left, bare rock soared straight up with no handholds. To his right and before him, the woods deepened. He pulled his hoverbike along, and sometimes he sat on it to rest. When he found a smooth rock or a fallen feather, he made sure it wasn't cursed before he put it in one of his saddlebags. The hoverbike's KM field rings were rated for big loads, 7,000 pounds at most. All he carried were his clothes, tools, canteens, fuel cells, one grenade, and some charge packs for his rifle. Sparrow began to see white goats where foothills rose from the forest and the sheer cliff became craggy. The rain stopped in the afternoon, and he sat side saddle on his hoverbike, watching them climb the rocks. He thought about shooting one. He took his rifle from his scabbard pack and looked at the goats through its sight. Then he put the gun away and continued watching the goats instead. While he was watching, a group of people came down from the foothills, heading west toward him. The people on the hills had tall hairstyles. There was a lot of blue in their jewelry. They all had short beards and carried cane guns that looked non-functional. Sparrow started his hoverbike and rode away from the approaching people. He found a little strip where he could open the bike's engine up and accelerated until the people were just moving black dots. Then he slowed and entered the woods again, still watching them. The mountain turned east, leaving its foothills behind. Sparrow left the woods and continued east until the hill country became riparian woodland. A river cut southwest, and Sparrow followed it upstream all day. By the time the river turned away from him, and the wet forest had begun to dwindle into savanna, the sun was crashing pink into the desert Sparrow had crossed before. He made another fire and shot a blue-furred thing with a long tail before it could dodge away. Then he ate, and he looked at the stars, and he fell asleep on his rubber blanket. He dreamed of a bright silver light flying over the ocean, which he had never seen. In the morning, the foothill people with the tall hair caught up to him. Sparrow woke to find himself surrounded. 4 men wearing blue jewelry were pointing cane guns at him. He looked first into their barrels and not at the men's faces. None of the guns had been hot for a long time. There was cesium buildup in their bores. The men held them like staves, their fingers nowhere near the triggers. Sparrow got to his feet with his arms raised. One of the men stepped forward. He was lean and agile. Nothing on him sagged or thinned. His improbable eyes were harlequin green. Besides his cane gun, there was no gone metal on him. "What tribe?" asked the man, scowling. His teeth were neat and white. He was just a baby. The beard on his chin was probably his first. "No tribe," Sparrow replied. "I came across the desert. My name is Sparrow." "What's that?" one of the men asked, waving the tip of his cane gun toward the hoverbike. "A CX-580, Sparrow said. "I'm just passing through. If this is your land, show me how to leave east, and I'll be gone by tomorrow." The men looked at each other. Another one spoke. "Aurora, the desert, is the end of the world. There's nothing beyond it." "Whatever you say," said Sparrow. "We're Naveb tribe," said the baby with the perfect teeth. "From here our land goes north to Aurel, south to Rorun, and east to the burning graves." Sparrow shook his head. "I don't know those places. I come from the west, across the desert Aurora, from the end of the world, your world." The young man made a face. Sparrow couldn't read it. He wasn't very good at reading faces. "North to the snow, south to the ocean, west to the dead city," said the man. "It's many months' ride on your CX-580, no matter how fast it is, even if it's the fastest machine in the world, our world. There's no getting out of Naveb land by tomorrow. No tribe. You'll come with us." "I don't mean you any harm," Sparrow said. "I'll go with you if that's what I have to do, but I'd really rather not." The young man poked Sparrow with his cane gun. "Where would you rather go then, Endworlder?" Sparrow shrugged, his hand still raised. "Away from you." foothill men laughed and tied Sparrow's hands behind his back. They used hide ties, no zips, no plastic. Sparrow had never met a full primitive before. He wondered about the Naveb near the dead city. Did they find plastic and metal in the ruins? Weapons, clothes, canned food? Maybe they didn't even enter the city for fear of ghosts. What a strange way to live. The men tried to put Sparrow on his hover bike. He complied with them, sliding into the saddle, and then he tried to tell them how to disengage the bike's grav brake so they could pull it. They ignored him and began going through his saddlebags instead. They held up everything they found and argued about what it was or how it came to be. They kicked his clothes, tossed them far away, and then bunched around them to try them on. Then there was an incredible bang, and Sparrow fell backwards off the bike. The bike dropped too, its kinematic field disrupted, and Sparrow made himself roll out of its way as it toppled onto its side. Sparrow's body felt filled, enlarged by enormous pain. He squeezed his eyes shut and gritted his teeth. Everything was muffled, and his head hurt as though someone were driving a pike through it. For a moment, he thought lightning had struck him. This was the only thought he could conjure as he writhed in the dust and bit his cheeks and his tongue. He rolled and twisted his arms, trying to free himself. The hide binds held, so he pulled harder, wrenched, screamed to be free, and flopped on the ground like a fish. Finally, enervated and racked with pain, he got his feet over the binds and put his hands in front of him. Then, gasping for breath, and with his ears still ringing, he was able to stand. He looked toward the source of the blast and saw the foothill men dead in a circle. One of them had found his grenade and pulled the pin. Oh, Sparrow moaned. Oh no. Oh shit. Morning cooled like an ember. Rain came again, from the east this time. Anvil clouds gathered, humped up to spread into each other, and then drained from the sky in a wind-torn gunmetal deluge. Sparrow couldn't make himself walk for a long time. He knelt instead and closed his eyes. His thoughts were scrambled. He tried to remember the last incantation Wren had taught him. When he finally did, other incantations came tumbling with it, like raindrops. Clarity trickled back. With water rilling down his face, Sparrow muttered healing words. 3 times he said the spell. The ether moved like thunder, and Sparrow began to feel better. He saw white behind his eyelids and felt warmth moving under his skin. The warmth drove the pain away. His ears opened again and his lungs heaved, unimpeded. He took several big breaths, filling himself. At last, his headache ebbed away, and he opened his eyes. Sparrow stood, twisting his wrists against the binds. They held as well as any flex cuffs. He went to his tipped hover bike and fished his knife out of his pack. The foothill men hadn't taken it out, probably because they'd known what it was. They'd all made similar weapons themselves, no doubt, as rites of passage into adulthood. Much was gone, but some things remained forever. Across the way out of childhood was a line of sacrificial blood. That was so often the way of things. However, death was not a door. Sparrow dropped his knife, trying to get a good grip on it. It took him some time to cut himself free. But once he did, he went to the place where his captors had killed themselves. The grenade had shredded them. They had all died instantly. He was lucky the explosion hadn't killed him too. His clothes were charred on the ground. One of the men had been trying to put on a pair of his trousers when the grenade went off. He stood in the uneven circle of black, watching the rain put out a dozen little fires. Then he gathered from the mud what remained of his things: firelighter, wrench set, 2 canteens, and 3 charge packs. His rifle was still beside his rubber blanket. He made a sling with his shirt tail and carried his gear back to his bike. There he packed it all back into his saddlebags, strapped on his scabbard, holstered his rifle, and rolled and tied his blanket. He thought about plain action and the order of things. The rain continued well into the evening, pounding the grass and the trees and the mud, while Sparrow tried to prepare his hoverbike's KM field rings. He finally got it off the ground and running just as night was falling. Thankfully, the rings were tough parts to break. By the time Sparrow started to bury his captor's remains, the rain had finally begun to ease up and roll away. In the deepening night, with the clouds poured out to show the stars, Sparrow mounted his hoverbike and sped off east again. East to the burning graves, he thought. He left the dead under cairn-marked mounds. Would they follow him too, as other ghosts had, before he crossed the desert at the end of the world? How many deserts would he have to cross this time? Sparrow kept his running lights dim across the nighted savannah. There was no telling who would be watching him now. That is the end of Chapter 1 of Sparrowmancer, a book that I wrote and recently published. It's on Amazon. I believe it's about $8. But if you would like for me to continue reading from this book, please comment and let me know. And I will be happy to read the next few chapters. Thank you for watching, listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.